Okay, good morning, everybody. Today is October 27th. Let me begin by stating that I'm sorry about Thursday's lecture. I realize that I uploaded the lecture, but I didn't actually activate it. And so if you're wondering why there was no posted lecture online on Canvas Thursday, that's why. So that was my mistake, and I apologize. We're still figuring out this whole HiFlex thing, so I'm sure you understand. But Thursday's lecture is now available in Module 4, even though we're now moving on to Module 5. Keep in mind, we will have Exam 2. That material is still good. So I do hope you'll go back in and check out Thursday's lecture. It is pretty important. We talk about the revolutions of 1848 and liberalism and nationalism. That's all pretty important. And on that note, excuse me, yes, we are now starting Module 5. So I hope everyone took Quiz 4. I hope everyone participated in the discussions. Remember, the notes are there. The material is there. Let's keep going. With that in mind, there is a little bit of material that was still in Module 4 that I do want to cover in a lecture. And the reason is because it's going to have an important impact as we move into the 20th century. So it has to be discussed. But we're going to move through it very quickly because I do want to get to the important material. And what I'm wanting to mention is the unification of Italy and the unification of Germany. And very quickly, we already know, because we've discussed this before, that Italy is a hodgepodge of various independent states, some bigger than the other. There are multiple different little countries in there. One of the real important ones are the papal states, that one section of Italy that was governed directly from Rome, directly by the church's country, if you will. Well, the tenets of nationalism are that every ethnic group should govern themselves, right? We've talked about that before. And so during the 19th century, there were a number of Italian nationalist groups that called for one Italy instead of all of these little bitty Italian states. And if you look up in the northwestern section, there is the Kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia. You can see it right over there. As Italian states go, Piedmont, Sardinia was quite affluent, very, I guess we would say, well managed. It had a high quality of life. It's an absolutely beautiful part of Europe, right on the Mediterranean coast there. Is about as nice as it gets. That's where all the billionaires in Europe park their yachts. The king of Piedmont, Sardinia was a man by the name of Victor Emmanuel II. The old Captain Mustache there is really decked out and fancy. And he has a prime minister named Camillo Cavour. Sorry about the pen here. This is the best I could find, the marker. And by the middle of the 19th century, the 1800s, the Italian nationalists that are calling for unification are now really pushing for him to become the king of a unified Italy. He should not just be the king of Piedmont, Sardinia. He should be the king of all of Italy. He was a very popular figure. He was perceived as being very competent and very talented. The truth is, he really wasn't. He was actually kind of a jerk, but his kingdom is doing well. And Camillo Cavour, who we see there looking an awful lot less royal, was really the guy who had the smarts and the ability. You will also recall, I think I mentioned this very briefly, that Napoleon III, the new emperor of France that took over after the Bourbons, actually had been an Italian nationalist earlier in his life. He had belonged to these groups himself, and there was a lot of belief that now that he is in charge of France, he will push to see Italy unified. Nobody really knew if he would, and even today, nobody's entirely sure how much he was behind it. But nevertheless, Piedmont, Sardinia, during the 1850s, is able to acquire more territory in northern Italy, eventually acquiring Lombardy and Venetia, those brown areas up there. The Austrian Empire is doing everything possible to try to stop Italian unification because Austria sees this as a threat. The Catholic Church does not want this either because a unified Italy would almost certainly mean the loss of the Papal States. That's kind of the crux of it. But this movement is simply too strong. And there were some other figures as well, which I'm not going to mention. But by about 1860, this is a movement that is pretty much unstoppable. The unifying forces called themselves red shirts. Piedmont, Sardinia successfully allied with Prussia, which was also undergoing a movement to unify Germany. And to go ahead and cut to the chase, in 1871, Italy becomes a unified nation. And the new capital will be Rome, and Victor Emmanuel will become king of it all. It is the House of Savoy, but that doesn't really matter. Now, what we need to understand is that this sort of throws off the balance of power that had been so important at the Congress of Vienna. Because now we have another great power in Europe, or certainly a potentially great power in Europe. And so now all of a sudden, things are a lot different. And I will point out that Italy was still and is still culturally very fragmented anyway. You know, Italy is not one country culturally, depending on how you look at it. Yes, they are all Italian and, you know, they look Italian and act Italian, etc. But North Italy and South Italy are, in fact, very different places. Even the language is notably different. I think I might have mentioned this before if I didn't. At the time that Italy was unified, the people of Venice and the people of Sicily could not have a conversation. The differences in the language were so pronounced that they could not communicate, even with the accents or whatever. So Italy has to now sort of be turned into culturally a unified state. And the extent to which that has happened, well, there you go. There is one tiny little place that didn't join the unification, and you can barely see it on this map here. It is San Marino. If you look right there, it's a tiny little microstate, and even to this day, San Marino is an independent country. It is not actually part of Italy. Also, the Vatican, which is in the center of Rome, which is about the size of this campus, is technically an independent country. When you step on the grounds of the Vatican, you are no longer legally in Italy. Moving forward, we have to talk about Germany, and I would dedicate entire lectures to this under a different set of circumstances, but we have to adjust. So I do hope that you will look this up in the notes and investigate it on your own. Germany is a hodgepodge of different states as well. You know, some big, some small, whatever. Prussia is now, by the mid-19th century, the dominant North German state by any measure. There are an awful lot of Austrians as well, of course, that are German. We've gone over that many times before. The unification of Germany has now been debated for decades. People are absolutely thinking that this should happen, although there are those that don't want it to. If we are to unify Germany, will it include the Austrian Germans, or will they be left on the outside? Remember that. Because, of course, if we don't include the Austrian Germans, then Germany isn't really unified, is it? But of course, in order to include the Austrian Germans, we would have to divide up the Austrian Empire, which the Habsburgs are not going to do. And if you're wondering, why does this really matter? Well, I can assure you, once we get into the 20th century, it most definitely will. In 1848, you will recall, after all of those revolutions, a group of liberal nationalists put together a constitution and offered the King of Prussia rule over all of Germany. And the idea was, we'll just exclude the Austrians and all of Germany can be one nation. But he turned it down. He decided, no, I'm not going to take the crown under those circumstances. A united Germany is a great idea. It's just I'm going to unite Germany on my terms, not yours. And so he politely declined. Well, someone is going to come along named Otto von Bismarck. Now, the king of Prussia is Frederick William, to be more specific, William the First. And Otto von Bismarck is his prime minister, his right-hand man. Bismarck was a firm German nationalist. He absolutely believed that Germany should be unified and that William I should be the emperor of the German people. And you will recall this is the House of Hohenzollern. You can write that one down yourself. Well, I'll put it on. I've mentioned them before. And there's huge debate throughout Germany. If we unify Germany, what happens to all of these other countries? Again, some big, some small. Bavaria, for example, was a bona fide kingdom. I mean, is the king of Bavaria just going to walk away and not be king anymore, right? Saxony is also a kingdom. Is he going to just decide, well, I'm not going to be king anymore? I think you can see where that's going to lead. A lot of these German people have their own nationalist tendencies. They wave their own flag. They recognize that they're German, but I'm not Prussian. I'm a Saxon, or I'm from Wittenberg, or from wherever. And, there's just an awful lot of cultural issues here. Are the German people really one people or not? Well, sort of they are, sort of they aren't, but it's something that's got to get worked out. But by the 1860s, like in Italy, the movement for unification was very strong. France does not want this. France sees a unified Germany as a threat. The French leadership see a unified German state as a nation that might build a big army and invade. It's a good thing that didn't happen, right? Yeah, right. Exactly. It didn't happen once. It happened twice. But nevertheless, again, moving forward, in 1871, Prussia fought a war with France. They had already fought a brief war with Austria, and in both cases, the Prussians won quite handily. So in 1871, Germany became a unified empire. And Germany went from looking like this to looking like this. So Germany is now one unified state. So look at the map of Europe. At the Congress of Vienna, Italy and Germany all fragmented up. Now if we look, we see Italy is a unified nation, Germany is a unified nation. The entire balance of power that had been set up has now been thrown completely off kilter. And the Crimean War was a big part of that as well, because France and Britain were no longer going to fight to maintain that balance of power. The Crimean War had been so unpopular. And to add to this, you can look, there is the little nation of Serbia, that little yellow right below Austria-Hungary. And the Serbs want to build a bigger Serbia. The Serbian people look around and they see a lot of Serbians not living within their borders, and so they want to put together a bigger country. The Ottoman Empire is dissolving. It is very quickly breaking apart, and everybody understands it probably won't be around much longer. So what's going to happen to all of that territory down there? How will that throw off the balance of power? That's going to be what is dealt with in the 20th century. And unfortunately, it was, a big part of World War I and later World War II with all of this. Another point to make about Bismarck that has to be discussed is that he was not a big fan of liberalism. He was a big fan of German nationalism, of course, but in his mind, liberalism was utter and complete nonsense. Bismarck was a firm believer in strength making the decisions. In other words, every great empire, you can look at Persia or Rome or whatever. If you go to antiquity, you can look at the modern era, the Spanish Empire or France under Louis XIV or whatever. And Bismarck would say, these empires were not put together by people being nice. These empires were not put together by congresses and parliaments that sat around and respected each other's differences of opinions, and then ultimately made a decision and everyone was happy. That's not how the world is actually made. That's not how great accomplishments actually get achieved. Bismarck argued that great empires are built when strong people make it happen. And there are always going to be people that try to get in the way, and those people are going to be the losers. Yes?
But like a lot of empires fail.
They all fail. Yeah, exactly. Empires rise, empires fall. You're absolutely right about that. And so it's one thing to build the empire, and then it's another thing to maintain the empire, isn't it? Right? And so and again, I don't know that Bismarck would get into this, but what a lot of political scientists look at is that tipping point for when and again, an empire doesn't have to have an emperor, right? America, for example, can be considered an empire right now, and we're a democracy, right? But you get what I'm saying, a superpower of sorts, a great, powerful global state. At what point do we reach the peak, and then at what point do we start declining? But more importantly, what causes the decline, right? What actually caused Rome to decline? What actually caused the Spanish Empire to decline? What actually caused France to go from being Europe's most powerful nation to not so much? What caused the British Empire to decline? And why do you think that we have a real vested interest in understanding what caused that failure? Because that's where, we're a great empire right now, right? So we want to make sure that that doesn't happen to us. And so you're absolutely right about that. What do y'all think causes empires to decline? What do you think causes, what do you think would cause a great, powerful global state to suddenly weaken and fall into decay and disrepair and eventually no longer be important anymore? What do you think are the factors that cause that to happen? Because it clearly has, as you mentioned. You're absolutely right. They all seem to do that. Well, what did the citizens do wrong? I mean, yeah, ultimately a country is the people, right? A country isn't the land. A country is the people. We could all agree to that. What do people do that maybe? Yeah, maybe people get too greedy. They get too complacent, right? When you're striving towards something, when you're working towards something, when a society is being built, it can grow stronger. But once you kind of get everything you want, you get kind of lazy, right? Do cultures do that? Do people do that, right? I don't know. And that's a sociological argument that historians have made, right? Before we were the most powerful nation in the world, we were willing to, get out there and move west and cultivate the land and build the industry and work hard, and everybody wants to have a better life than their parents, right? And now that we have everything we want, are people still pushing that drive forward? Well, it's hard to say, right? It's difficult to say. I don't know. I tend to follow along the line of the progressive theory of history, which argues that at the end of the day, it's always about money, right? Rome declined because it went broke, right? Spain declined because it went broke, right? And so if an empire manages its finances properly, that empire will succeed. The Ottoman Empire, huge, powerful empire across Asia and Europe. It declined because it went broke. Ran out of money, and they couldn't afford to maintain their borders, couldn't afford to keep security, and before you know it, it was a snowball effect. So I always argue that at the end of the day, you have to manage your money. What will cause your family to fall apart? Money, right? What's the number one cause of divorce? Money, right? And so manage your finances properly, and you'll stay strong. And so I think that's where that is. But you're back to Bismarck. That would be one thing to tell him. Yes, we build these big empires, but they always collapse, right? Bismarck's famous quote is that the important decisions are not made with parliaments. The important decisions are made with blood and iron. Now, I'm paraphrasing that. But the short answer is none of these empires were formed nicely. Rome did not build its empire by being polite to its neighbors. It conquered its neighbors, didn't it? Right? Cyrus the Great did not build Persia by being friendly. He built Persia by conquering the neighbors. Right? Alexander the Great conquered. Right? That's how Alexander the Great became Alexander the Great. And if you go to Bismarck and you say, yes, but the United States is this great, powerful empire, and we're a democracy, and we believe in working together, he would say, how did you get all of that Western land? Did you go to those Native Americans and say, please give it to us? Right? Everybody knows America got what it wanted by conquest. We took it from the Native Americans, we took it from Mexico, et cetera, et cetera. And so he would say, y'all are a democracy in front, that's the face you put on. But at the end of the day, America conquered. And that's how America became a great nation. And so Bismarck would say, what I'm going to do is I'm going to unify Germany. I'm going to build a powerful Prussian military, or use the powerful Prussian military that already existed. I'm going to defeat every nation that doesn't want it. I'm going to steamroll over anybody that gets in the way, and Germany is going to be unified. The world has winners. The world has losers. We're going to be winners. You don't get what you want by being nice. Kind of difficult, right? But he hated democracy. He thought democracy was stupid. He thought Congress and parliaments and whatever were stupid. All they do is sit around and argue all day long and waste money and, allow themselves to be corrupt. He would say that, the one thing we think about the Roman Senate is that they were all just a bunch of corrupt bureaucrats, weren't they? A bunch of corrupt elitists. Does anybody in here think the U.S. Congress is actually honest, decent men and women that are making positive decisions, right? I think the latest approval polls of the U.S. Congress is something like, 88% of the American public doesn't like the Congress, right? Because they don't, they're not real leaders is the idea. Now, I'm not saying that he's right. I'm not saying I agree with that, but go out there and win and conquer and steamroll over the enemies and build that nation, and that's how it actually works. That's how it actually works. How did Jeff Bezos build Amazon? Yeah, right? He didn't do it by, being nice. How did Bill Gates build Microsoft, right? He crushed all of the competition and was just ruthlessly interested in winning. And Bismarck says that that's really how the world works. And the sooner we all embrace that, the better we'll all be. What's going to happen after the unification of Germany is that German intellectuals and German society, particularly German leadership, is going to now argue that this unified Germany deserves to be the top dog. This unified Germany deserves to lead Europe. All of these other nations have had their chance. Germany has never been unified before, and now that it is, it will have the largest economy in Europe. It will have the largest population with the exception of Russia. It will have by far the most effective military, and now that we are in the industrial era, Germany will become the most industrialized European state, which should make it the wealthiest European state. The Germans argued that the 20th century will be the German century. And a phrase called Germany's place in the sun became something that everyone was striving toward. Everyone was taught it is Germany's turn for a place in the sun. And following that logic that Bismarck was pushing forward, what are we going to do with those countries that just don't want to accept this fact? We're going to beat them, right? We're going to crush them. We're going to launch a war and we're going to stomp them. And that's it. There's winners and there's losers, and we're going to be the winners. This is really scary, isn't it? Because Germany is just openly saying we are going to build Europe's dominant state, and any nation that gets in our way, we are just simply going to crush militarily. And Prussia had been so successful at that up to this point, it gets really scary. So, of course, what's going to happen with Russia and France and these nations that obviously are on Germany's borders? They're going to start building their militaries too, right? Because when your neighbor says, I'm going to war with you at some point, obviously you're going to get ready for it. So this militaristic attitude is going to take over the continent. And we already know it doesn't end well, but we'll get into the details of that later on. You see the ball rolling. Very quickly, France was defeated by Germany, by Prussia specifically in 1871. I just mentioned that. And that marked the end of Napoleon III. He was pretty old at that point. And the French got rid of him as a result of that conflict. And at that point got rid of all of the royalty, all of the nobility. France declared itself a republic, and France has been a republic ever since, even though it's gone through a few different types of governments. And so since 1871, France hasn't had a king, a queen, an emperor, any kind of nobility or any of the rest of that nonsense. And if you go to France today, the people don't want it. The French people see it as an important part of their history, but there is no interest in France today about bringing back the Bourbons or the Bonapartes or whoever else it may be. They have concluded it's all nonsense. After 1848, with Franz Joseph in the lead in Austria, The Austrian Empire continues to move along, but nationalist movements continue to weaken the empire. And by the early 20th century, even though if you look on that map, it's that big giant orange area, by the early 20th century, the general logic is the Austrian Empire is going to radically change. This will not be the Austrian century. This is going to be the century where Austria declines. But nobody really knows how that's going to happen. And it's going to be World War I that does it. I guess I should briefly mention Russia. Russia continues to move along, but it does not make progress in terms of industry. Russia has a handful of cities that are very beautiful and very European, notably St. Petersburg. But Russia continues to be an absolute monarchy, an autocratic state that is very corrupt and quite behind the rest of Europe in terms of economic development, literacy, you name it. However, during the early 20th century, and this is not a picture of him here, this is a picture of Alexander II, but a new czar will take the throne, Nicholas II. Under his rule, Russia no longer is an absolute monarchy. It wasn't something that he wanted to see happen, but it still did. And he was certainly no reformer, but what we will see in the early 20th century is Russia start to get its act together. Russia starts to build up its industry. It starts to really put a lot of investment in things like railroads and economic development. More schools start opening up. The Russian leadership, by Russian standards at least, is definitely making progress. And I only mention this because this becomes a very real fear of the Germans. This united German empire is now looking at Russia and thinking that within a generation or two, Russia may actually be a real player to threaten Germany. And so a big impetus for starting World War I was stopping Russia before Russia got too strong. We'll get to that later. The United States fights a big, nasty civil war over slavery in the 1860s, and after that becomes also an industrialized nation. And during the second half of the 19th century, the United States rapidly develops, puts a lot of investment into industry, railroads, etc., particularly in the northern states. So by the 20th century, the United States is actually the world's #1 industrial power. We don't have much of a military, but the amount of industry in the United States is huge. Britain gives Canada independence in the 1860s. We'll move on from there because they're Canada. They're awful quiet. We don't need to worry about them. And now let's actually talk about what I'd like to discuss today, even though we're a little late, but we can make it happen. Let's go back to the Enlightenment for a minute. Let's go back to the Enlightenment. Logic and reason should be what governs society, right? We should make decisions based on rational, human, inductive knowledge. I think everybody in here thinks that makes sense, right? We will have a better society if we use logic and reason to choose our laws. Democracy, for example, is a much more logical way to have a government than to say, we're just going to have some king that we pretend God picked, right? That makes a lot more sense. And the Enlightenment is definitely an important step forward in human progress. Nobody would dispute that. By the 19th century, there's going to be some thinkers that maybe say no, that look at a society governed by logic and reason and think, I'm not so sure that this is necessarily the right path. And from this, we will have what is called the Romantic movement. From this, we will have the Romantic movement. And we can see the Romantic movement in art and music and human creativity, but also it will start to emerge in law and intellectual pursuits. Now, you say to yourself, no, I can't go along with that. Logic and reason make sense. Logic and reason is definitely the way we should govern society. How could you argue that logic and reason can't make it work? Of course, the Enlightenment thinkers had it right. Well, what romantic thinkers are going to argue is that there are truths, there are elements of the human condition that simply cannot be understood that way. We cannot logically understand everything about being human or what it really means to be a human. Everything from what makes us successful, what makes us happy, what defines a well-lived life, what defines a successful society. Not only do logic and reason not necessarily answer that, but in fact, in many cases, they may take us in very disturbing directions. How about I give you a little example? I want to talk about human behavior. Now, are human emotions a natural part of the human experience? Do we all experience emotions from the moment we're born to the moment we die, and do those emotions play a role in the decisions we make? Okay, good. In that case, since we are all Enlightenment philosophers, I would like you to logically explain love. Use your logic there, Mr. Voltaire or, Mr. Diderot, and I want you to explain love to me in logical terms. Does love exist? Is love important? Is love part of the human experience? I would sure hate to go through life without ever loving anybody or being loved, right? Nothing logical about it. Or at least you certainly couldn't understand it that way. As a matter of fact, how about jealousy? How about happiness? How about sadness? Pick an emotion, Logically explain to me what it is. Get where I'm coming from? You have to experience being human in ways that the philosophers couldn't ever possibly hope to explain in order to actually really be human. How about this? We'll put this in a way the philosophers could understand. We'll get real philosophy about it. Let's take a baby and raise him in a room where we give him every bit of knowledge that human beings have ever known. The entire breadth of human knowledge. This kid gets the very best education possible. But we never let him see any color except black and white. Is this kid gonna know what green is? Is this kid gonna know what blue? But I'm being logical. I'm teaching you everything you need to know, kid. How are you gonna know what colors are? You have to experience them, don't you? You have to take them in and experience them in a way that is part of the human condition but cannot be explained. So what the romantic thinkers would argue is that yes, logic and reason has a place, but it doesn't give us all the answers. You see where I'm coming from? It doesn't answer everything. Being human is a heck of a lot more complex than those Enlightenment thinkers were arguing. And so they were able to put a few pieces of the puzzle in place, but they weren't able to do it all. Feeling, experiencing, going through life is much more than just what they said. We're not just a bunch of robots. Heck, I can't even define success for you. I mean, if anything, we should be able to understand what a successful life is, but success may not necessarily mean having a lot of money, right? Success may not necessarily mean having a lot of friends. Success may not necessarily mean achieving the same thing that other people achieve. Everybody's kind of got their own version of success, don't they? Does success exist? Do I know a winner from a loser? Do I know somebody who has had a successful life versus somebody who has not had a successful life? Of course, we can figure that out, can't we? Can't logically explain it. Can't logically show you. And I can't come up with a logical blueprint for what will make you a success. You have to figure that out for yourself, don't you? And how do you figure that out? Well, you got to go live your life, don't you? Artists are going to embrace the romantic movement. I want us to take a look at this picture here for a minute. I want us to look at Napoleon. Two pictures that sort of deal with the French Revolution. We got Napoleon here on the left. Now, logically speaking, this is a very, very good portrait of Napoleon, right? It is almost photorealistic. If I want to know what Napoleon looked like, that tells me exactly what it is, right? That's Napoleon right there. Y'all get where I'm coming from, right? A philosopher would look at this and say, yes, that's the way a picture ought to be. And all throughout the French Revolution, because logic and reason were so important during the Revolution, David painted all sorts of photorealistic pictures. Y'all saw the one with Napoleon crowning himself, right? This is what it looked like when you were there. Now, I want you to look at the picture to the right. The woman waving the tricolor flag, going over the parapet or whatever, the mound. The soldiers are fighting, bringing freedom to the people, topless, of course, because we're talking about France here. She's got to be topless. This never happened. There was never a topless lady charging over a barricade on a battlefield or in a street or something. But you get a feel, don't you? I know what's going on in that picture, right? I feel the energy of the revolution. And this is actually from a little bit later, but which tells you what is going on? Well, it's the one to the right. You see what I'm saying? The one that actually gives you an understanding of the experience is something that is completely illogical. That never happened, and it never would have. A topless lady waving a flag on a battlefield or whatever that's supposed to be. How about this? Look at the man against, on the rocks, right? Staring out. We don't know what this guy looks like. It's kind of blurry, but you get a feel for what he's experiencing, right? This is a man facing the world with the water and the rocks, and heck, the artist painted it from behind. I don't know what this guy looks like, but I know what's going on, don't I? And then look at that nice little pastoral scene, right? It's blurry, right? It's impressionistic, although we're a little bit pre-impressionist here. I get the idea of a nice summer day, don't I? Right? It doesn't precisely show everything, but I get the idea. Down below, we have Socrates taking the hemlock because he was told that he would have to recant all of his philosophy in order to survive. Now, in this picture, we have Plato, we have Aristotle, we have Socrates saying, I would rather die than violate my principles, so somebody pull my finger. Plato and Aristotle were not that age. This picture never actually took place. This is designed to show you what Socrates was going through. It's not designed to be an accurate representation of his suicide. Let's talk about writers for a minute. During the Romantic era, we see a new type of writing emerge, a new type of entertainment designed to bring emotions out in people, designed to get people to think about being human. We start to see the first romance novels. And everybody knows what trashy romance novels are. And what I can tell you is that in terms of great literature, none of them fall into that category. They're very poorly written, but they bring out those emotions. Is she ever going to see him again? Well, all you ladies are just crying up left and right after reading those books. They're not great books, but they do something. They make you feel a certain way. And so they, even today, just crank them out, assembly line. What you see here is Edgar Allan Poe. What did Edgar Allan Poe write? What's he known for? Yeah, horror, scary horror stuff, right? The Raven and all of these. Think about this for a minute. I am going to write a story that is deliberately designed to scare you, deliberately designed to frighten you. Now, I don't know about you, but logically speaking, we're not supposed to want to be frightened, right? Being scared is a negative emotion. So why on earth would I want to read a book specifically designed to scare me? Well, maybe because that's an emotion that we want to experience. We have some sort of urge to go through that. There's nothing logical about it. But imagine what the world would be like without horror novels, right? Without horror stories, without scary stuff. We're about to have Halloween, right? Again, we have dedicated an entire holiday to scaring each other. Doesn't make any sense. That's not logical, right? Oh, and by the way, logic and reason can solve all of our problems, right? Well, you remember Mary Wollstonecraft. I talked about the female philosopher and the really sort of first women's rights advocate. Well, she had a daughter named Mary Shelley. She had a daughter named Mary Shelley. And Mary Shelley grew up to become a writer herself. And does anybody know what Mary Shelley's book is, what the most best-known book that she wrote? What she's best known for? Frankenstein. She wrote Frankenstein. Now, what's the story of Frankenstein? We have this brilliant scientist, right? This incredibly talented man. And he is going to solve the ultimate human problem. He is going to defeat death. He is going to use logic and reason and all of that high intelligence to ensure that people can live forever. The greatest achievement science could ever have. And he succeeds, doesn't he? But of course, he doesn't create something good. He ends up creating a monster. That in fact, this desire to defeat death itself is not a good thing. It ends up being a bad thing, right? Now, there's all sorts of different themes in Frankenstein, but clearly one of them is maybe all of this logic and reason isn't quite what we need to be chasing. Maybe there's something really bad here when we start opening that door. You see what I'm saying? Maybe we should embrace the idea that humans are not necessarily logical creatures, that we're a lot more primitive than we want to believe, and maybe that's part of being human. And so she's looking at her mom, and she's saying, Mom, I know you embrace logic and reason, but no thanks, I'm taking it in a different direction. Talk about teenage rebellion, right? She went against the very thing that her mom became best known for. Instead of doing something great, Dr. Frankenstein did something terrible. We're not supposed to understand everything about humans. And we're not supposed to think we're smarter than Mother Nature, are we? And of course, today, in this era, we have a better, even though we're constantly seeking more progress, one of the themes that everybody in here always seems to figure out is that Mother Nature always wins, right? And that the minute we think that we're smarter than Mother Nature is the minute we get knocked down a peg. We're going to conquer nature and prove that we're better. And inevitably, Mother Nature turns back around and says, no, you won't. Right? No, you won't. Well, moving on. I want to talk about science. I want to talk about some of the important scientific advancements. Pardon me there. Because we are going to start seeing progress during the 19th century that will have absolutely tremendous payoffs for us moving into the 20th and 21st. It is during the 19th century that we finally start to see all of this scientific study genuinely pay off. All of this study that had been taking place since Francis Bacon, for the most part, had been confined to books and labs and smart people, but human society had never necessarily changed. Understanding the elements, understanding biology, understanding astronomy, understanding all of this stuff had never really changed human life any, but now we're finally going to start to see it. And I'm only going to give a few examples, but here is what I'm talking about. One scientist during the 19th century was a French scientist named Louis Pasteur. And Louis Pasteur is the father of microbiology. Microorganisms were known to exist for generations. Nobody really knows when the first microorganisms were observed, but we do know that it was hundreds of years before Pasteur. But smart people thought that they were benign. Smart people thought that they had no impact on our lives, that they were irrelevant. Pasteur wasn't so sure about that. He began to see the world as being interconnected, and he said, look, these animals, these microorganisms have to eat, don't they? Right? These organisms have to reproduce, they have to excrete, they have to, do what organisms do. And since I can now figure out that they're in us, on us, everywhere, maybe they have a much greater impact than we think. And he came to conclude that a lot of the illness that we experience is due to these microorganisms. And he comes up with the germ theory of disease. And the reason why when I'm sick, the people around me tend to get sick too, is because they're taking in those germs. And that a lot of the illnesses are a result of that. He comes to conclude that infection is the result of microorganisms. If you get a cut on your arm and those microorganisms are in there, well, they're going to live on you. And when they start consuming and reproducing, well, that's going to cause you to become infected. He also concludes that food spoilage is a result of these microorganisms. Why does a piece of meat go bad? Well, these microorganisms are living on the meat. The excretions of these microorganisms are obviously going to smell bad. You can connect the dots there, and that's why spoiled food stinks. Now, you were taught in middle school that Pasteur invented pasteurization, right? We've all heard about that. And this is right along those lines. He concluded that milk is spoiling because of these germs. And that if you kill these germs, the milk won't spoil. The problem is, in order to kill the germs, you got to boil it. And boiling it destroys the proteins in the milk and makes the milk go bad in another way. And so all pasteurization is getting the milk hot, but not getting it hot enough to boil. So you heat it up enough and most of the germs die, but the milk itself doesn't change. And so you get it close to boiling and then you cool it back down. And if you do that, the milk will last a lot longer because you'll kill off most of the germs. He also, of course, figures out that refrigeration will preserve food better because it slows down these microorganisms. They can't act very quickly when they're cold, which is why food lasts a lot longer in cool environments. Pasteur's germ theory of disease was not embraced. It took decades, actually, before it is considered established science. Joseph Lister, you don't have to write this down, was a man who who agreed with Pasteur pretty early. And he begins to argue for antiseptic use, chemicals that will kill germs so that medical environments can be a lot cleaner. And even though he's easily able to demonstrate it, he invents a substance he calls Listerine. You've heard of that before. It's still around. It was an antiseptic. And the idea is you clean down medical workspaces, and that way people don't get infections nearly as much. And he was able to demonstrate it. Yes, it really works. I mean, he had all the research he showed, but doctors were real slow to take it on. It really wasn't until the 20th century that routine sterilization is considered the norm. So it's kind of interesting there. Michael Faraday is interested in electricity. Michael Faraday is interested in electricity. Faraday had no formal education. But he was a very curious person. And electricity, of course, has always been known in some way or another. Everybody sees lightning. Hey, that stuff right there, right? A very famous American was able to demonstrate that the electricity we can create on the ground and the electricity from lightning is the same thing. And who was that guy? Benjamin Franklin, exactly, the great kite experiment, which may have actually been done by his son. We're not sure. But what he did was he tied a key to a kite, and when the lightning hit it, he was able to show lightning and electricity are actually the same thing. Electricity had been generated at the time basically as a parlor trick. They would create devices that you could spin around and would create an electrical current. Everybody's dealt with static electricity, right? You scoot across the carpet and then go up to your brother and pop him on the back of the neck. That's always a lot of fun. Of course, nobody really knew what electricity was, and more importantly, nobody had any idea that it could be useful. We can actually harness electricity to do stuff for us. Nobody thought that was realistic, but Faraday wasn't so sure. Faraday's logic was there is some sort of power here, and if we can consistently create it and consistently generate it, perhaps it could be used, and maybe we should do this. And what he did was invent the first electrical motor. He was able to take electricity, send it in a direction, and get something spinning as a result, taking electricity and turning it into mechanical energy. Now, there's going to be other pioneers in electricity that go a lot further than that. Perhaps you've heard of Nikola Tesla, who invents the modern version of the electrical motor, and we know there's a car company named after him. He's sort of a giant as well, but he comes along later. He's a 20th century figure, 19th and 20th century figure. Also, Thomas Edison. We've all heard of Edison, the big inventor. George Westinghouse. All of these men pioneered turning electricity into something useful. But it all started with Faraday, the first electrical engineer, and he's the first man to demonstrate electricity can be used for stuff. And I don't need to tell you how important that's become. The electrified world is vastly different in so many ways than the pre-electrified world. It's just absolute night and day. Nothing has changed the human experience more, perhaps, than the harnessing of electricity. How about we get to Charles Darwin? How about we get to Charles Darwin? He is worth discussing as well. Darwin was born into an extremely wealthy English family. They were not noble, they were not nobility, but they were super rich. Hang on. And this meant that he could pursue a life on his own terms, and he decided to become a scientist. He decided to become a biologist. And he studied all different types of biology and made a whole bunch of minor but nonetheless impressive biological discoveries of sorts. Plankton and various types of things living in the water aren't plants, for example, that he was able to show. But in 1848, he became the scientist on board a British vessel that traveled to the Galapagos Islands. The Galapagos Islands are a few hundred miles west of Ecuador. So they're technically part of South America, but they're pretty far out into the Pacific. And it's a little archipelago, a little island chain, not very big, not very important in any notable way. They're not inhabited. Nobody's lived on them. What makes them unique, of course, is that they've been isolated for a long, long time. And so the animals on the Galapagos Islands are very unique. There are animals that live on the Galapagos Islands that don't exist anywhere else in the world. And Darwin wanted to know why. Why is it that this little island chain in the middle of nowhere has a unique biological footprint? Where do these animals come from and why are they different? Now, he was not the only person that was asking this question. This is something, and of course the theory of natural selection that he comes up with is not entirely his. He's just the guy that publishes it first. But Darwin started looking at humans and our own development. And it is well known, and certainly not disputed, that humans have selectively bred animals over the centuries to meet our needs. You know, cows and chickens and dogs and cats and sheep and goats and whatever. Farmers always selectively breed varieties of these animals to fulfill certain roles. And nobody disputes that. We also do the same thing with plants. You know, the food that we eat has been selectively bred to create certain characteristics. That's just part of the way farmers work. You know, that was the Neolithic Revolution. And so Darwin got to thinking, well, maybe Mother Nature does the same thing. Maybe Mother Nature selectively breeds animals to have certain characteristics. And so over generations, species can change. Much like, again, look at dogs, right? Every dog is genetically what? Not a dog, it's a what? It's a wolf, yeah. Every dog is a wolf, but over the centuries, humans have bred dogs from them. Which, when you look at some of those goofy-looking dogs out there, it's pretty crazy to think that genetically they're actually wolves, but they are. And nobody disputes that. I mean, it just kind of is what it is. And so Darwin's thinking, okay, if Mother Nature is doing this, how? You know, how is Mother Nature doing this? And this is what Darwin finally was able to sort out. Nature is all about competition. You know, every animal is competing to eat, competing to survive, competing to reproduce. And so, if an animal has a mutation, if an animal has a little bit of an advantage over its competitors, it's going to be more likely to survive, it's going to be more likely to reproduce, and thus pass that mutated advantage onto its offspring. And over many, many, many generations, little advantages that certain individuals have will end up playing a big role. For example, if you take a bird that has to crack open seeds in order to eat, the members of that species that have a little bit stronger beaks are going to crack open more seeds, aren't they? That means they're going to eat more, they're going to be more likely to survive, and their offspring will inherit the stronger beaks. The members of that species with the weak beaks are not going to eat as much, and they'll be most likely to die and not reproduce. And this is part of Darwin's study. He actually looked at birds. And so over time, this species of bird will get stronger and stronger and stronger beaks. And over the course of hundreds or thousands of generations, we actually end up with a different type of bird. Its ancestors had weak beaks, but now it's got strong beaks. But what happens to the seeds? Well, the seeds with stronger shells are less likely to get cracked open and eaten, right? And they're most likely to germinate. So the seeds will evolve stronger shells to deal with the stronger beaks. And hence we have a different type of seed. We end up with a different type of bird. If horses are eating plants, trees that have more up here than down there are going to survive, aren't they? And so trees will suddenly start evolving in a different way to have more leaves up high where the horses can't reach them. So the trees will start to get taller and the leaves and the canopy will start to go so the animals can't eat the leaves. But then, of course, horses with a little bit of a longer neck are going to be able to reach those, aren't they? And they're more likely to reproduce. And before you know it, the horses have longer and longer and longer necks and become giraffes. And the trees evolve and everything finds one way or another to balance. As again, Mother Nature always wins. So farmers engage in artificial selection of animals, picking and breeding animals with certain characteristics. Mother Nature apparently does the same thing. Instead of it being artificial selection, it is natural selection. A very good example of natural selection is cattle. You know, cows are not natural, okay? Cows are big, dumb, slow. They taste really good. They have a lot of milk. They let you milk them. Mother Nature does not evolve animals to do that, folks. That's not how it works. What is a natural version of a cow? Well, no, that's a male cow. That's a cow, too. Longhorn were selectively bred. Longhorn were selectively bred to fight off wolves. That's what the longhorns are for. And farmers actually created longhorns. They continued to breed them with longer and longer horns. And the best way to show a longhorn is like this, right? Down, right? Because boomer sooner. I don't like Texas. No, I'm talking about bison, buffalo, right? Yeah, bison. Bison and cattle are genetically compatible. And I can assure you, you do not want to try to milk a buffalo. Okay, you're in big trouble if you try to. Buffalo meat is also a lot leaner. There's not a lot of fat in it. It's real hard to cook buffalo properly. You can do it, but it's hard to do because it's so lean. But see, humans didn't like that, right? I don't like buffalo with, no fat in it. And so they bred different versions of it. And this was long ago, Neolithic era type stuff. But, they bred cows that were fat, that were dumb, that were slow, that let you milk them. So there we go. Well, then comes the big question. What about people? Did we evolve, right? Well, Darwin is going to publish his first book that doesn't discuss this. It is called Origin of Species in 1859. It is a sensation. Many different scientists had been looking at this, but Darwin is the first person to get it in print, so he's given credit for it. Speaking of those high trees, every time I give this, I always have I always think back, the horses and the trees and everything. Who in here climbed trees when you were kids? That was fun, wasn't it? When you take little kids and you put them in a field with trees, the first thing they do is start climbing up in those trees, right? It's just kind of cool. Everyone in here climbed trees when we were kids? It's fun. I always think of that when I think of the giraffes and the horses and all that. Anyway, Darwin published Origin of Species. It was a sensation. It was a big hit. It was not controversial either. People understood this makes sense. But then, of course, that does open the question, what happens with people? Did nature evolve us? And, of course, the big issue is, did humans come from apes or something along those lines? Well, that's not exactly the case. In 1871, Darwin publishes a book called The Descent of Man. And in this book, he explains that, yes, humans have been subject to the very same evolutionary forces as every other species. That over the course of hundreds and hundreds of generations, we went from being Homo habilis and Homo erectus, even though he did not know of those at the time, into what are people. Now, Darwin is not saying that we evolved from apes. That's the big thing. Darwin says we came from apes. Now, by the way, what's the difference between a monkey and an ape? A monkey has a tail, an ape doesn't have a tail. Okay, so that's the difference between a monkey and an ape. Darwin is not saying that we evolved from apes. What he's saying is that we are apes. We're apes. I'm an ape, you're an ape, your friends are apes, your mom is an ape, your dad's an ape, we're apes. Okay? That's what we are, right? You look like a monkey and you smell like one too, only it's an ape. What is the number one fruit that human beings eat? What is the number one fruit above all? Bananas. That's right. Humans eat lots of bananas. And what's the thing about monkeys and bananas? They like bananas, right? Apes like bananas. Well, we do too, right? Oh, and did I just ask y'all about climbing trees when y'all were kids? Right? Oh, yeah, that's what that's all about. That's why I brought that up. Of course. That's a throwback to way back long before we were humans. You've got this sort of biological instinct to go climbing in those trees, folks. And again, if you don't believe me, just take a little kid and put them near a tree, and the first thing they do is, start swinging from that tree. But, by the way, that's my class that dressed up for Halloween about 5 years ago. This is the typical model that we go with. Now, of course, the researchers today, paleontology actually doesn't say we come from, that's a little bit more accurate, I think, right? I'm somewhere in there. I'm not entirely sure that I'm at the end of the line, but as long as I'm not the back of it either. I think it's hilarious because that's me when I'm like 30, right? I haven't bothered to upgrade my picture, so if you want to know what the young, handsome version of me was, well, there you go. We definitely are not descendants of gorillas or baboons or orangutans. They are branches, but we do share a common ancestor. But there's different branches of the of the tree, if you will. What is the genus that we belong to? What is the genus of ape that human beings belong to? It's the genus Homo. And so we are Homo sapiens. Before us, there were, again, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo ergaster, all of these others, and we call them proto-humans. What's the most recent proto-human that most people think of when we think of like cavemen and all of that? Neanderthals, right? Neanderthals. Now, Neanderthals were not humans, and actually Neanderthals were a branch. We did not evolve from Neanderthals either. Neanderthals branched off and were separate from us. But the Neanderthals disappeared about 40,000 years ago. We don't necessarily know why they went away. It might have had something to do with them being Neanderthals, right? But in any event, we are the only members of the genus Homo left on this earth. So there we have it. And also on that note, we got to go. We're going to talk about Marxism on Thursday, but that's it for today. Go, and I hope you eat lots of bananas and go swing for some trees, and I will see everybody on Thursday.